Today we're talking about the project at Fry's Run Park, and we're talking with Jim Wilson. Jim, do you want to introduce who you are and let us know what your role was in the project?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Jim Wilson. Currently a recreation specialist with Northampton County Parks and Rec. But at the time this project was implemented, I was working for the County Conservation District, and I was the project manager for the project, which started in 2014.
And what hazards were present that prompted this project at the site?
Okay, so the project, it was dubbed as the Fry's Run Watershed Restoration Project. It was specifically focused on stabilizing several hundred linear feet of severely eroded stream banks at Fry's Run Park, which is just a 5-acre park at the bottom of this watershed. The focus was to address those issues using structural practices, construction practices, as well as tree plantings. So the issue was these severely eroded stream banks and a lack of streamside buffers, for streamside trees at the park. These were resultant really from, the hazards of frequent flooding, and then a hazard of the continued erosion would have been the subsequent sediment pollution into Fry's Run and ultimately into the Delaware River. Just erosion as the sheer forces and stresses of floodwaters continued to eat away at these raw, exposed stream banks um, at the park. So what we did was in 2008, 4 or 5 years prior to the project, the Conservation District developed a watershed conservation plan for Fry's Run. So it's a very small watershed. It's just 6 square miles in size, has about 16 miles of streams in the watershed, and we were focused really on just about 800 linear feet of those streams miles at the park. So the plan, the watershed plan, the Fry's Run Watershed Conservation Plan, identified, among other things, a lack of buffers, streamside vegetation throughout the watershed, as well as stream bank erosion due to uh, past and frequent flooding. It's a very flash floody watershed, and flooding is a big hazard there, as it is throughout the county, but especially that watershed. The plan discovered that about 44% of the stream had no forested buffer on either side, so almost half of it was void of any um, trees or shrubs, and only about 8% of those 16 stream miles had any buffer on just one side. So the plan, the Watershed Restoration or Conservation Plan, called specifically for protecting and restoring and establishing stream side buffers, throughout the watershed.
And what was the timeline for implementing the plan?
So let's see, at the park itself, one side was forested and the other side had no trees at all. And it was on that side that the stream banks were really steeply eroded. Now the park sits less than 300 feet upstream of its confluence with the Delaware River. So it's particularly prone to flooding, both in the main, the mainstream of the watershed itself, plus backing up, floodwater back up into the stream from the Delaware River. So we were looking at addressing, like I said, about 800 linear feet of the creek through the park. Um, and what was involved there was the first phase. This was a 2-year project. The first phase, which began in 2014, was the construction of 7 structures made from big rock and timber that were actually built into the stream bank using a backhoe and lots of manual labor to help protect the bank. These structures, um, and I'll describe them in a minute, they were actually, they're designs from the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. So they're approved designs the Fish and Boat engineered long ago, primarily for fish habitat, but they also provide a good deal of protection against the erosive forces of flowing water. by deflecting the flow away from the stream banks. So these 7 structures consisted of 4 log vein deflectors, which were, I don't know, they were about 15-foot long logs, simply hemlock. They were hemlock logs that were trenched into the stream bank. Maybe the better part of half of that length was trenched into the bank, and the other half stuck out into the water at an upstream angle, so that water flowing over the log would actually deflect out into the creek. So we had 4 of those. We had 2 mud sill cribs, which are these large crib-like structures that are essentially a big log frame built into the stream bank, extending out into the water a bit. And then they're just chock full of big rocks. They protect the stream bank behind them, and again help deflect water, flowing water out into the creek. And then we also had a stone deflector, which was a big, about a 30-foot long triangular rock structure built into the creek at a particular angle that also helped deflect water away. They were constructed over the course of 4 days. Once they were finished, the cribs anyway, the log deflectors, they were trenched in and they were done. The rock deflector, the same thing. It was constructed with the rocks and that was completed. The cribs, it was the frame chock full of rock, and then it was topped with soil, seeded and matted, so that the idea was that sediments would slowly, in high flow situations, would land on top of this rocky, soil covered structure and accumulate, and in time vegetation would grow there and it would sort of extend the bank a little bit into the creek. And that took I think 3 or 4 days in 2014, the actual construction part. And then the second phase was done a year later on Earth Day in 2015, and that's where we planted 200 trees, potted trees that were, and some shrubs, anything from like 4 to 7 feet tall. We planted about 200 of them along the top of the stream bank, and then extending 30 to 50 feet away from the stream bank. So that was done, the initial planting in 2015. It was Earth Day 2015. And in the subsequent years since then, we've added trees each year to replace those that have been lost to just natural, they've died for whatever reason. And occasionally we've been able to fill in some empty spaces with extra trees. So we've probably planted the better part of 300 trees along that 800 linear foot stretch of creek since 2015.
And were there any particular obstacles you faced in implementing the plan, and how were they addressed?
So there actually were no obstacles in implementing the project. It went off pretty much without a hitch, but the obstacles arose subsequent to the project, which took the form of just a steady stream of floods that started within a year of the construction of the project and have pretty much continued each year since. And so flooding will be a challenge, a long-term challenge to the integrity and the long-term effectiveness of the stream bank structures in particular, not so much the trees. So we did the plantings did the construction project in 2014. 2015, we did the plantings in April of 2015. Just several months later in June, we had our first big flood down there. It was a very localized flash flood, specifically to the Fries Run watershed. Something like 5 inches of rain fell in an hour and a half. So it really came ripping through the stream valley there, and it gutted all the stone out of one of the 2 mud sills. Took out all the stone, of course, all the soil and plantings that were on top of that, seeding. It didn't really impact the trees that we had planted just upslope of the creek, but it left just the log frame in place. So fortunately, we had enough stone left over from the original project that we were able to refill that crib. The lower crib lost some stone. There was a mud sill crib built several hundred feet downstream of the upper one. That one didn't lose as much stone. The upper one lost all of its stone. So we were able to fill that back up with stone. We chose not to cover it again with soil and to seed it and mat it, knowing how flashy that creek is. It was only a matter of time until the waters came up and washed all the soil and seed out. So we were just allowing Mother Nature to sort of deposit soil, and sediment in high water events, kind of cover all that stone with a thick layer of mud and sediment, and eventually seeds would sprout on their own. So we let it go at that in 2015, and then 3 years later in 2018 we had two big back-to-back floods, one in August and one in November of 2018. And the August flood was so violent that it not only gutted both sills of almost all their stone, it also completely destroyed the lower crib. It was a huge flood. It crested 13 feet above the top of the bank. So it tore down some big, massive trees alongside of the lower crib. And when that tree came down, it was a big Osage orange. And the entire root ball came up and tore out from the ground all the logs that were trenched in to form that crib. So that crib was completely destroyed. The trees did an amazing job. I mean, by this point, they were 3 years in the ground from 2015, and they had grown like weeds, in that rich floodplain soil. So they were upwards of 6, 7 feet tall when we planted them. Now they were well over 10 feet tall, and not a single one of them was pulled out of the ground and lost. However, all of them were, the flood, like I said, or I think I mentioned a minute ago, it crested about 13 feet above the top of the bank. So some of these trees, almost all of these trees, were actually submerged completely, and the velocity of the flood waters just bent them right down to the ground. So the trees were bent to the ground, almost all 200 of them. But again, not a single one was pulled out. I mean, it was such a testament to the power of a root system to keep the tree from getting pulled up and taken away. So the trees lasted. They certainly outlasted the man-made structures. So that was in 2018. So immediately within 24 hours, we had to help these trees. They weren't pulled out of the ground, but they were completely flattened. So they would have grown in a flattened sort of position, eventually turned upward toward the sky, but they wouldn't have looked that attractive. So within about 24 hours, we had a small army of Parks and Rec staff, and volunteers. Couldn't have done any of this without the amazing volunteers from the Friars Run Watershed Association and the Watershed Coalition of the Lehigh Valley. We descended on the site in muck boots and removed massive amounts of flood debris from the stream banks, from the trees themselves. They were all wrapped in all sorts of debris from upstream. And then we went to work immediately on pulling all these trees back upright again. So we bought hundreds of linear feet of arbor tie, a material that you wrap around the tree and then tie to a wooden stake. We bought a couple hundred 4-foot long oak stakes that we pounded into the ground and then pulled the trees upright and tied them to those stakes. It was relatively easy to do because the soils were completely waterlogged. They were very viscous, so you could easily pull these trees and the roots right back upright. Had we waited till it dried out, it would have been like concrete, and the trees would have just stayed where they were. But we were able to get them all back upright, mostly just with man and woman power, elbow grease. Some of the bigger ones, we did have to winch back upright, but we got them all back up, left them staked and tied throughout the summer. And then we finally took the ribbons, the ties, I should say, off later, I think in the fall. The stakes are still there, so they're all ready for the next big flood. We just need to tie them back up again. That was how we addressed the trees and trying to we salvaged them all and got them all back upright again.
So, what was the impact of the project and how is it functioning today?
Well, the impact, we had about a year's worth of protection against the stream bank from 2014 into 2015. So there was some protection of the stream bank with the structures that we built. Trees, however, did an amazing job stabilizing the soils and helping to take up nutrients and sequester carbon, and they help slow down the floodwaters, the velocity anyway, as the waters come crashing against the trunks of the trees. So they're doing well. They're anchoring the soil, they're anchoring themselves. However, the structures pretty much sit there, pretty much in ruin. We will be addressing that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the August 2018 flood was the big one. Then in November of 2018, another flood. It was less severe, didn't reach the height that the summer flood did. It didn't really impact the trees a lot. It didn't bend them over. There was a lot of debris wrapped around the trunks, but it didn't crest into the upper reaches of the trees to bend them over. But what that flood did do was deposited tons and tons of gravel and silt and completely buried what remained of the lower mud sill, pulled out some more of the stone in the upper one, but completely buried the lower mud sill, and actually deposited so much gravel that it pushed the lower reach of the creek in the park about 30 feet south of where it had been. So it's now 30 feet south than it was initially. So in other words, that lower crib, even if it weren't destroyed, would sit on pretty much just on gravel. There's no water even flowing under it. It moved ferocious a floodwater that it moved the stream 30 feet or so further south and away from where the stream bank had previously been.
In your opinion, then, how would you assess whether it was a successful mitigation project or not?
Well, yeah, yes and no. The structures were wrecked in the flood, so therefore they really didn't mitigate the flooding and the stream bank erosion hazards that they were built for.
Mm-hmm.
But the trees were a different story. Mother Nature certainly once again trumped any kind of man-made structures there. We planted the trees; they were done by the hands of men and women, but they're natural organisms, and they just took there, rooted well, and they continue to do their job of mitigating against maximum flood damage. They help to slow down the velocity of stream of floodwaters once the floodwaters climb up out of the banks, and we're moving out along the stream or along the floodplain there. They slow down the floodwaters. They stabilize the soils. They continue to uptake nutrients and sequester carbon. So they're mitigating for the community. We will address the structures, and we'll talk about that here in a minute.
Okay, so our CREATE project is about creating a vision of community resilience. How would you say that this project contributes to the resiliency of the surrounding community?
So the trees, these, I keep going back to the trees, but they really are the heroes here. They literally bounce back, the definition of resilience. Once the floodwater subsided, we were able to help them, pull them back upright again. They weren't impacted at all really in the lesser flood in the fall of 2018. So they're doing their job. They're mitigating against erosion. They're reducing floodwater velocities, uptaking nutrients. But what was really interesting, I found that it was really our local conservation colleagues and our friends and just the everyday neighbors there in the Fry's Run Park community who were really among the most resilient resources to come out of all of this. I mean, they came out, almost unsolicited to help, the park bounce back from those two big floods. A lot of men and women and kids came to help clean up and repair the damage that was done. So the people are as resilient, really, as the natural resources there.
Sounds like kind of like a volunteer triage unit.
It was, and we now have like a flood mitigation toolkit, which includes 4 foot long oak stakes. We've got all this arbor tie. We've got a winch ready to help pull up to reset some of the larger trees. So it's something you kind of need in this day and age of increased flooding when you want to salvage and protect and restore the streamside plantings that you do.
Is there still work to be done at the site?
There is. So the trees, like I said, they're doing fine. We do continue to supplement the plantings each year. Um, I connected with the Fish and Boat Commission after the 2018 floods, which were really devastating throughout the Lehigh Valley. The county received significant funding from FEMA, and we also applied to DEP for watershed restoration funding. So Fish and Boat is redesigning, sort of re-engineering those structures, and we do plan to rebuild them, hopefully sometime this year. We're in the process now of selecting a contractor to design a better plan, and then go to construction hopefully later this year, repairing both of the mud sills that were destroyed, and extending them a little further downstream, because those floods actually gouged out even more stream bank a little downstream of both structures. So we'll have to expand those structures and beef them up to withstand these higher velocity floodwaters.
Wow. Are there any further next steps or expansion of the site elsewhere, expansion of this project elsewhere in the community?
I know that the conservation district, it's the same employer, it's the county of Northampton. I was with the conservation district, now I'm with parks. It's just two different departments with the same employer. And I'm working with those folks to possibly do some more stream bank restoration projects upstream of Fry's Run, the Fry's Run Park, or upstream of Fry's Run Park, I should say. Fry's Run, it's a beautiful watershed. It's very bucolic, limestone farm valley, essentially. There's not a whole lot of development down there, some residential development, but no commercial development or industrial development, lots of ag land. I'm trying to mitigate against, flood damage further upstream from the park. The park, is at the bottom of the watershed, so it really gets inundated. It's at the bottom of the watershed before all that water pours out into the Delaware River. It really comes roaring through the park. So we're hoping to mitigate further upstream to reduce some of the impacts at the park, down the road.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that I didn't touch on?
Well, I do want to recognize all the partners who were involved in this project and continue to be involved from 2014. We had funding initially from the Coldwater Heritage Partnership. We had a $10,000 grant from them back in, I think we applied for that in 2013, and we were able to implement the project in 2014. That paid for the equipment and the contractor and the backhoe. We also had funding from the Watershed Coalition of the Lehigh Valley and Lehigh Gap Nature Center for the plantings, for the trees. Other partners who helped either with time or materials were the Wildlands Conservancy. I mentioned the Fry's Run Watershed Association and the Watershed Coalition of the Lehigh Valley. Actually, we had work release inmates from the prison helped with the project initially too, the construction project. So we were able to put folks to work that enjoy getting outside and helping to improve the park. Fish and Boat Commission, of course, designed the project. The County Conservation District, Parks and Rec. So just a bunch of great volunteers and staff from just some great partner organizations.